And now it's time for Omniversica, the greatest show on the internet, with your hosts, Dan Schneider and Art Durkee.
Welcome to Omniversica, the largest radio show on the internet. This month's topic is poetry. What's wrong with it? What's right with it? All the things that we like about it and most of the things we don't like about it. Of course, that's a very long list. So without further ado, here's my co-host, Dan Schneider, and we'll dive right in with our guests.
Well, this month we have a couple of opinionated poets, which is a rarity. First off, let me give my own personal kind of definition of what poetry is. Now, anyone who's listened to some of our shows in the past, we've talked about that, and both Arthur Durkee and I write poetry, and we did an interview with a great American poet named James Emanuel about 6 months ago. I describe poetry as a written art form whose quality of and concision in word choice is structurally non-prosaic, in both senses of the word prosaic. Now, I've read thousands of other definitions, and some are right on, but I think for me, that sort of sums things up. But let me get on to our two guests. The first guest is a fellow named Fred Glaysher, and he has a website, www.fglaysher.com. That's GLFGLAYSHER.com. And I came across him a few months back, or maybe about 6 or 7 months back, when I was researching the Poets Against the War website, and he had written a rebuttal to the New York Times article on the piece on the website. And our second guest is a man named David Alpaugh, who I came across earlier this year when he wrote a two-part essay, I guess, in Poets and Writers magazine, basically detailing his grievances about why poetry has gone down the chutes, especially in the world of academia. And David doesn't have a website, or do you? But he does have a press, Earthrise Press. No.
It's Small Poetry Press.
Oh, Small Poetry.
Yeah, Small Poetry Press, and I do have a website, Dan. It's Small Poetry Press, allruntogether.com.
Okay, and we'll put that on our website when we get this up. Anyway, let's kick things off. I want to talk about, in this first segment, about the world of academia. And we might as well start with David. If you want to recap your two-part articles, some of your major grievances that you had about the world of academia.
Well, basically what I'm arguing in my article is that there has been a revolution in the way in which poets are educated, sustained, published, and rewarded. And that this revolution started back in 1934 with the inception with the granting of graduate degrees by the University of Iowa for creative work, and the subsequent establishment of the Iowa Workshop, and then
the infamous Iowa Poetry Workshop.
Yeah. Some good people came out of there, though. Stanford then joining in shortly afterwards, taking a while to accelerate. I think very exciting in the beginning, as any new enterprise is. It must have been very exciting for poets to be able to go into the academy and find a community and senior poets to study with. As it proceeded, it started to burgeon. We now have over 300 graduate programs granting advanced degrees with emphasis in poetry, and many more offering poetry as part of their creative writing program.
All of them seem to advertise simultaneously in Poets and Writers. I'm sure I'm not the only one to have noticed that.
My article was on both sides of the columns. I mean, there were advertisements for various conferences and programs and such, yes. I think as this thing has proceeded, you have ended up with a small group of what I call professional poets who have somehow managed to seize control of the levers that allow ultimately, and this is my current concern, for wide readership for poets. They control high publications, both literary journals and presses. They control all of the important prizes, the prizes that you cannot send in your $15 for and submit your poems or manuscripts for. They control fellowships, grants, all kinds of goodies on that end. And basically, I have noted over the years that they keep this very jealously within the profession.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
And the thing is, it's splintered into that. There's really 2 or 3 groups. There's what I call the dead white males, which are the Ashberries, the Halls, the guys who may still be sucking in air but have done nothing for 20 years.
Right.
Then there are what I call the PC elitists, which are, disaffected minority groups of one persuasion or the other. And then there are sort of the outsider rebel hipsters, sort of the descendants of the beatniks or Nuyorican poets. And these 3 groups, they all employ the same kind of tactics, and they're mutually exclusive. And one of the things that's always frustrated me is I really don't give a damn who's writing a poem. I don't care whether it's a Walter Delamere, whether it's a kid, in 20 years from now, whether it's a black kid or white kid. A good poem is a good poem, and I've always thought that good poetry has more in common with itself. A great poem by Walt Whitman has more in common with a great poem by Lee Poe or a great poem by Sylvia Plath than it does with lesser poems by those same 3 individuals.
Absolutely. Yeah, I agree with you on that. I'll tell you just a little brief story of how I started to think about this whole situation. When I started writing poetry back in 1989, shortly afterwards, I became acquainted with a poet out here who died about 5 years ago, Harold Witt, who was a very, very popular poet in the 60s and 70s. He was in the New Yorker 17 times, in the Saturday Review 35 times, had a book from Macmillan. But in the 80s and 90s he continued to write and publish. His poems started to appear more in second spring journals. He was no longer in poetry. He was no longer in the Saturday Review or the New Yorker. All those things kind of disappeared. And I was talking to him shortly before he died, around 1995, and I asked him, how he interpreted that decline, what he saw as the reason, since I didn't see any really major deterioration of his poetry. And Harold Witt said to me, and by the way, Harold Witt had a very small inheritance from his father early on in his career, and so he was able to just live very frugally and modestly in a little house here in Orinda, and just write poetry. He had originally started a career as a librarian. He was able to resign that and just concentrate on reading and writing poetry. And he said that his decline was due to the fact that that when he started writing, the creative writing programs were not a powerful element in poetry. But as he continued to write, they became more and more powerful, and he was of no interest to them anymore because he did not have a full-time teaching position at a college or university in a creative writing department, and therefore could not in any way reciprocate if he were invited to conferences, if he were awarded prizes, or if he were giving those high visibility publications.
So he couldn't scratch their backs back.
Right.
But,
yeah, he was of no interest to them.
But there's another factor in all this too. Due to the workshops, unfortunately, we have more books of poetry being published per year than ever before in history, and it's the sheer numbers have got to have something to do with this too.
Absolutely.
It's just, I'm always reminded of Theodore Sturgeon's law. Ted Sturgeon was a great science fiction writer and one of the better prose stylists of the 20th century, in my opinion, even though he's always been ghettoized as a science fiction writer. But he had this law. He basically said that 95% of science fiction or of any other literature is crap. Mm-hmm. And I think that that's become obvious the more, poetry has been published per year. So it's quite possible that someone of genuine talent, such as Harold Witt, can just get drowned under the sea, as well as the "I'm not scratching your back because who are you?"
Yeah,
thing.
Right. Well, if you look 50 years ago, the population of the U.S. was about 160 million, and there were maybe 50 major magazines that published, quarterly or so. So you had maybe about 200 total opportunities if you were a poet to get into a magazine. Now, with the internet, with small presses that can start up themselves, you're talking anywhere from 5 to 10,000. So you're talking an increase of 10 to 20-fold, and the population hasn't even doubled. And there wasn't even enough good poetry 50 years ago to fill up the magazines.
Yeah.
So
we're talking incredible new math in poetry. If you were to take just two websites, Poetry Daily and Verse Daily, each of which publishes a poem every day, and spin that out over the year, they're publishing 730 poems a year, 7,300 in the decade. If they were going at the end of the century, they will have published between the two of them 73,000 poems.
Yeah.
Trace that back to the source, since and by the way, they don't tap from the internet. They do not publish from other internet sites, only from hard copy collections, magazines, and anthologies. Trace it back to the source, allow for duplication, and we're talking about 1 million poems published from Poetry Daily and Verse Daily and their sources in the 21st century. And we haven't even gotten into the internet yet. We are going to have a situation in the 21st century where a professor of English will go into a classroom as a specialist in the 21st century with maybe 100 million poems in print to contemplate. How can one person contemplate?
Well, they're all one poem, basically.
Right, well, yeah.
And all the little mundane things about the little personal self.
Ooh, confessional poetry.
Well, Fred,
only the slightest variations on those themes run from 1950 forward to the moment. And personally, this is what's nauseated me for decades and what I've tried to write and find a different path away from.
If I have to hear one more poem about Sharon Olds' Black Stool, I think I'll puke.
Well, Fred, you have been a big promoter of Robert Hayden, and I've always thought that he was one of the more neglected poets. I mean, he was a black poet, but he was someone who was also sort of neglected by the black poet
very much
elites.
And
more radical side.
And quite a good essayist as well.
Yeah, and so, I mean, in a sense, it's nothing new. I think it's just the numbers. I mean, we had a poet on 6 months ago, James Emanuel, who I think is almost a mirror image in a lot of ways of Hayden. He's someone he once sent me a blacklist of black publications that have, blacklisted him. And, when I think of someone like a Hayden, who I think is a better poet than a T.S. Eliot or an Ezra Pound, has never gotten his due, even now, nearly a quarter century after his death. I mean, it's nothing new, but again, it's the volume, it's the numbers, and it's also, I think, a lot in part due to this artist truth bullshit. People write to feel good about themselves. There's that kid who's dying of cancer, Maddie Stepanek or something, who's had like 5 or 6 best-selling poetry. Yeah, and I mean, it's nice, and you don't want to say anything bad about the kid, but I mean, come on, that's not really poetry.
Mm-hmm. Well, Hayden wrote a lot about history. And he's writing in a time when people are writing confessional poetry, increasingly. Right. He didn't fulfill everybody's cliches. Blacks who wanted a radical, he wasn't radical. The man was not an Uncle Tom, but he was accused of that by Leroy Jones at the time and others. Yeah. And so on. And people really just can't deal with that complexity of a historical vision and a sense of history and the tradition and working within that.
And the thing is, too, I mean, recently I got a post to my website from a local poet woman who, after years of knowing her, now claims that she never met me because I supposedly dissed her in an essay of mine. But one of the things, as I've seen over the years to the Twin Cities, named poets come around, there's an almost kind of I mean, for all the talk about artist truth and whatnot, there's such a level of insincerity. When Donald Hall came to read at a local church about 5 years ago, this was a few years after his wife had died, and Hall is a terrible poet, his wife was arguably even worse. But what really angered me was the man was crying on cue. I could almost count the number of beats after when he read a poem, when he would start tearing up. And I've seen so many poets do that, whether they're talking about nuclear war or they're talking against rape, as if there's great big pro-nuclear war and pro-rape parties out there. I mean, they take these safe subjects, someone's death, someone's this, and you can it's a nice sentiment, it's nice.
Everybody will agree.
Yeah. Right, but it's not art.
Yeah, Auden long ago said something I thought was right on political poetry. He says, very often political poetry comes to us begging for a special pass, saying, well, I'm not really a good poem, but you probably agree with my politics, so give me a pass. And
just
make believe that this is real poetry, and that's happening all over.
That's just as common in contemporary music, by the way. You can get away with a piece by making it emotionally stirring and giving it a political title, but so everyone overlooks how actually very poor it is. So,
Yeah, and I remember a few years ago, and this is a thing that was lauded as some great stand for art. When W. S. Merwin, I think it was in '97, was editing the Yale Younger Poets series, he refused to pick a manuscript. But the thing is, he only had 10 or 12 manuscripts to choose from because all the rest of the manuscripts were weeded out by 19, 20-year-old twits who are not going to know what a good poem is. And that brings us to the obvious. All of these scams, pay $25 for a readership fee. I mean, if I had the money and I had my own press and I could start, I don't care, if I get, Leda and the Swan, if I get something of a Yeatsian or Rilkean quality, I don't care if it's scrawled in shit on toilet paper. I'll publish it, But we don't take simultaneous submissions. It has to be double space, this, that. It's like these ludicrous kind of qualifications.
And the themal anthologies, where we're doing an anthology on Outsiders or Glass and Beads or Bread and Breakfast. So the editors sit like spiders in the web. They get the 8,000 poems sent to them on that theme, and then they pick what are the best 50 poems on that theme, even though none of them are very much worth printing.
Yeah, and an anthology should be a collection of the best of stuff that has appeared and has sat around for some time, rather than just new stuff that's come up. I remember I had a poem in an anthology once that I forget what the theme was, but the poem right next to it was one of these poems that made me want to cringe. And it's like, I don't want my poems playing with those poems.
Yeah. Right now, probably somewhere at a Barnes & Noble or Borders or independent bookstore, there's a high school, a girl or guy. They're standing in the poetry section. They have become interested in poetry for one reason or another, because they have a really good high school teacher. They've just discovered it themselves. And they are reaching up and pulling down a book called Best American Poetry, 2002. Yeah. How sad is that?
Yeah, David Lehman. Oh, don't get me started on him.
There's another problem with the anthologies, and this is something I've heard a couple well-known poets even complain about as far back as 20 years ago. One of the problems with the anthologies is these people who are ensconced as poetry professors in academia or directors of workshop or MFA programs, they will get poems by their friends in the anthology and then use these anthologies to teach in the classroom. And then they get the marketing side of it is what really irritates me, because then they get these blurbs by their colleagues from elsewhere across the country who are also academic poets teaching MFA programs using their anthologies for teaching in the classroom. And so they write these blurbs back and forth to each other, and they're all mutually like worshipful societies, and nobody is honest, because if you say anything negative about me, then I won't write a good blurb about you, and you lose all your credibility.
Right.
I feel much of what we're talking about is sort of basic convention and revolt.
It's academic politics.
We have this convention of postmodern poetry that's developed for the last 50 years or so. And about the self and the personal world, and it's become narrower and narrower and more and more stultifying. And anyone truly trying to find a way out into a different literary form and experience is anathema to everyone else whose bread and butter depends on maintaining the status quo.
Yeah.
And it only gets worse.
Well,
this has happened many, many times in literary history, not only Western, Eastern history is full of it as well.
It is the business of the profession to repress aesthetic revolution.
Well, it's
the last thing in the world they want is either a revolution in subject matter or in aesthetics, which
but it's odd because then all the poets that people praise were at one time people who did that.
Yeah.
Whitman or Stevens or Rilke.
But they didn't have an organized institution standing in their way trying to keep them from readership.
Donald Hull's a good example. I mean, early on, he wrote some books about Robert Frost and other poets, and was someone who was doing something new to get away from their work back in the 50s. But it's become very stale.
Well, let's wrap up this segment, and we'll come back and talk about politics and poetry. But Arthur, you might know there was a similar kind of situation in the world of science. There's a famous quote by someone that basically the only way revolutions occur in science is the old guys die off. And do you know what?
I don't remember who that is, but in fact, I've just spent most of the past 2 days reading books on fractals and the history of how chaos math has come to dominate science these days is fascinating because, of course, Benoit Mandelbrot, the radical, visionary, intuitive mathematician who was out there seeing the same patterns recurring in so many different disciplines, was dabbling here and dabbling there and being poo-pooed by everybody. And now pretty much everybody, they either try to cut him down or they worship him. So it's very much a parallel situation.
Okay, well, we're going to end here, and when we get back, we're going to talk about poetry and politics. And now let's listen to a poem from David.
Statement. Today I am throwing old checks away that lay in a shoebox 5 years, fearing audit. They're free at last to burn or decay. Money still talks, but her ghouls simply say, something was sold at a price and you bought it. Today I am throwing old checks away. Each bears its signature, year, month, and day, and pays to the order of mammon due profit. They're free at last to burn or decay. Here's one for Sears, here's one for ballet, airfare to Rome, a homeless benefit. Today I am throwing old checks away, saying ciao to old wolves they kept at bay while they tended our credit and fed it bit by bit. They're free at last to burn or decay. I crumple the papered past. I murmur, hooray. It's my shredder now must reconcile. Chit, chit, chit. Today I am throwing old checks away. They're free at last to burn or decay.
All right, we're back here talking with David Alpaugh and Fred Glaysher, two poets who have spoken their minds on certain stuff. And in this second section of the show, we're going to talk, we're going to lead off with Fred Glaysher. And earlier this year, during, I guess we'd call it Gulf War II now, there was a website put up by a fellow named Sam Hamill, who's the editor of Copper Canyon Press, and it was called Poets Against the War. I think it was .org. And I had done an essay about it, and that's how I came across Fred Glaysher's letter to the editor to the New York Times regarding this website. And I have to say, I'm someone who's of a moderate bent, and I'm not a big Bush fan and whatnot, but I found so disingenuous this website because, number one, they claimed that the claim was that Hamill had turned down an invitation or had spoken up or out against the war, when the real circumstance was the First Lady, Laura Bush, who, I have to say, I like Laura Bush. I don't like her husband, but I like her. She has been more supportive of the arts than any First Lady since Jacqueline Kennedy. And she invited him and a handful of other of these basically dead white male poets to come and read some poems, having nothing to do with the war, having to do with the celebration of arts, which for a politician or a politician's wife is amazing. And the guy took very opportunistically took a stand, gathered a bunch of dim-witted poets to post these terrible, horrible, horrendous political poems on this website, basically snubbing the First Lady. And I'll tell you, I'm a registered Democrat, but I just thought that it was garbage. I mean, the poetry was garbage. The whole motivation was garbage. It was see-through. And Fred Glaysher was one of the few people, I guess, online that spoke out against that. So, Fred, after my ranting here, if you want to just say what your letter was about and maybe give your own take on that.
Well, I was similarly appalled at the whole reaction by Hamill and other poets to the White House invitation, really. And I I had to do something. I just viscerally, it just shook me so much. I'm just so sick of that type of politicized approach in terms of writers and poets, and always taking the stance of kind of climbing up on the barriers and we're going to correct the right thing. I feel the United Nations is something that needs to continue to be developed vastly more than we have been. There's a lot of blame to go around. The United Nations has many problems in itself of radicalism and political intrigue and manipulation too. But I'm not a unequivocal supporter of Bush. I didn't vote for the man, but I felt that he did do the right thing after 9/11 in a lot of ways, and that we need to be really serious with what we're confronting as a nation and a people, and indeed as a world. And I feel, one thing, Bush definitely needs to work more closely with the United Nations and help develop it. This has been one of my interests and passions going back for decades, really. And when I saw this whole Poets Against the War thing, it was so trivial. It's so predictable once again. I just had to speak out.
And it was just a networking tool. I mean, this was how low caste poets that have no name could maybe get a little bit in, so that later on they could be published in the dozen or so big name poets. And
everybody jumped on the bandwagon.
I'm going to step in here because I'm not quite as cynical about this whole thing as you guys are. I'm going to disagree to a point, because I've been reading Sam Hamill's poetry, essays, and stuff published by Copper Canyon Press for about 25 years now. And while they do have problems as a press, this is actually not a particularly jump on the bandwagon thing for Sam Hamill, because he's been doing this kind of activism his whole life. He was a conscientious objector during Vietnam, went to jail for it, later taught poetry programs in the prison, yada, 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 spent time in Japan. So, there's a little bit more going on here than just some kind of cynical, oh, hey, I'm going to jump on a bandwagon and jump out against the war. And beyond that, there's a certain amount of sincerity, because other people were protesting against the war too. I thought the war was a stupid idea myself. That doesn't make now, having said that, I basically agree that 99% of the poetry on the Poetry Against the War site is trash. And a lot of it's familiar trash, things that we've already seen in print elsewhere that somebody just, basically submitted. They even solicited me to contribute a poem, and I contributed a pro-peace poem rather than an anti-war poem. As far as I know, I'm the only person who did that. However, as problematic as the poetry is on that site, there's a certain level of political action that is justified if you want to speak out against something you disagree with. I mean, that's called the First Amendment right.
That's fine, but the point was, and I think this is Fred's point too, is that had nothing to do with the First Lady's invitation. That was a celebration of the arts, not politics. She was not there saying, "Come if you support my husband." She was there, "Come to support the art of poetry."
I'm a little unclear on that.
Yeah, I think it was let's seize this opportunity and exploit it and use it.
Well, I'm less cynical about it, because a lot of the people that she was inviting are people who are supportive of her husband. Sam Hamill was one of the few people, I think, who was not somebody in their camp already.
I think there was 2 or 3 dozens, and as far as I know, there were a lot of leading lights. Who's the old woman from Vermont? Grace, is she still alive? Grace Paley, I think she was on the list. I mean, there were a lot of left-wing radicals too. I mean, that's the thing that was, to me, the most, when I saw the list of names, there were people. I mean, this was as apolitical as you could get. And the thing that really got me is I saw some essays online that were written by Sam Hamill where he just really totally distorted the whole thing and made it seem that it wasn't that the First Lady was inviting them for an art thing, and he politicized it. And he can do that, but he should pay. He should take the barbs for it.
It's poetry that pays the price.
Yeah.
In the public image.
Sure.
And all the more contempt and marginalization as an art
But at the same time, what about the argument that's been made about, hey, this put poetry on the front page, This got poetry on the front page of the New York Times. People actually talking about poetry.
Yes, what all the radicals are doing, once again.
Well,
with nothing practical, no real intelligent confrontation with the realities that we confront and are trying to murder us. In no uncertain terms.
I'll give you another example of cynicism.
Once again, poets have failed. They failed our culture. They have failed our culture by writing only about their own contemptible little lives.
Yeah.
There's life outside ourselves called history and the big world.
Yeah, but that's true. But now we're bitching about poets writing about the big world.
Wrote about that world.
Well, but the thing
I've been reading Cervantes all summer. Cervantes wrote about his culture. In fact, he wrote about Islam a lot.
And so did E.M. Forster. My point here is we're bitching about petty poets writing about their petty little lives, and then we turn around and we're bitching about poets, some of whom are actually trying to write about world events. Maybe they're not doing so well writing about it because, I'm not disagreeing about the quality, but, are we bitching too much here? Let's be clear about that.
It's always easy to bitch. And
it's way easy to bitch.
There's a real genre going back for decades, really. I mean, way before Joya, Dana Joya's essay and others.
It goes back centuries.
Absolutely. Dryden and Johnson all complained about
Swift.
too many scribblers around. So there's an element of that too, Arthur, I'd say. But we're really at the end of a dead literary period.
Okay.
And the only way a new literary period can come about is the way they always do. A new master steps forward and buries them with a book that changes the absolute direction of everything.
Yeah,
I would welcome good political poetry. I think that usually good political poetry tends to be satiric. I see very little satire being
here
today.
Yeah.
I see mainly just rant. I love the poetry of Bertolt Brecht, but Bertolt Brecht thought about his politics, whether you agreed with him or not. He had a real political, intellectual philosophy
Marxism, socialism, and all the dreck that has corrupted modern literature to an exceeding amount. And really, a lot of that's in the academy. Look, I spent years on deconstruction and all that trash. Whether literature or whatever the academy produces, Robert Hayden said once to me, everything they touch, they ruin. And absolutely true. I've never wanted anything to do with the academic world. I spent years when I first got out of high school intentionally studying on my own, and I only went to the university after I found out who I was as a writer. And that's the problem. You're writing David's articles on the MFA programs are so right on. That is a lot of the problem.
Well, and I think
professionalization of it all.
And I think one of the things, I'm going to, in the back of my mind, when I have a chance in the next few months, I wanted to do an essay on Carl Sandburg, because I think one of the best political poems of the 20th century was 4 Preludes on Playthings of the Wind by Carl Sandburg. And it's a poem that came out 2 years before The Wasteland, but I think it's a vastly superior poem. And it's written by a guy who has been totally marginalized, totally put into this little corner as some sort of hick banjo-playing poet. But, I mean, it's a great poem.
Is that the poem, Dan, that has the refrain, we're the greatest city?
Right.
Yeah.
I mean, it's a terrific poem.
Well,
it's concise.
The style. I mean, Sandburg's nice, but, there's no sophistication. This is my opinion. He's okay, but he's the old form. And there isn't that intellectual depth.
I would disagree. In that poem, it comes through. It comes through in the metaphor. I mean, I don't have the poem in front of me, but compared to, say, T.S. Eliot's poem, and I think The Wasteland, you can argue, is a great poem. But Eliot, to me, is so mad. Eliot is so reeking of the sky falling down 20s, where someone like a Sandburg or someone like a Robinson Jeffers are so much more fresher. Their stuff actually could have been written, a year or so ago. Whereas in Eliot, a Pound, that whole high modernism, and I think that's one of the things with when you get into these isms, when you put yourself in an ism, whether it's high modernism, whether it's confessionalism, whether it's this ism or that ism, you're basically putting a shelf, an expiration date on your poetry.
You're setting yourself up to work within a particular stylistic frame, and then if you try and break out of it, all the little black crabs try to pull you back down into the basket, because how dare you stand out?
And poetry just becomes reactive. I think for
exactly
the modernists were. What interests me about the modernists is that they're almost phobia against America. They all fled America, and also against their own biographies. They did not write about themselves at all. You would have no idea that. And I think Wallace Stevens is a great poet, but there isn't any Wallace Stevens the man really in Hartford, Connecticut with his wife and his house. None of that is.
But that makes him that much more interesting.
That makes it more interesting, but I think that after many, many years of that kind of cap being put, you get this explosion both with the Beats and the Confessionals, who suddenly react against that and want to talk and talk and talk and talk.
I mean, I don't want to know anything more about Sharon Older's bodily fluids.
Right.
I mean, come on.
Well, one of the problems is there's cycles in these things, and that you get an ism and someone reacts against it, and that creates a new ism for somebody else to react against, and then it just cycle perpetuates. I mean, I tend to think that, if there's going to be a great new wave in poetry, I don't know that it's necessarily going to be from some great person publishing a book that changes everything. I think it may actually be something of a...
That's the only way literature periods have ever changed.
Yeah, I agree.
Absolutely everyone. Virgil buried the Alexandrians. Cervantes buried 200 years of chivalry,
but you see
writing in Spain and elsewhere, in Provençal.
Maybe that's true sometimes, but I don't think it's true every time. I think that tends to be the way that we see history as a filter.
Confessional poets buried the high modernists.
Well,
and they did
let me make my point here. The point here is that sometimes those single great men who come out, or women who come out with a single book that everybody does, are writing in total obscurity until after they're dead, including people like Emily Dickinson, as well as others. Okay, my point here.
Her little poems didn't do anything to change anybody else.
Yeah, but
during her lifetime.
Yeah. Well, but they change people after her lifetime, okay? And it's expecting people to do it during their lifetime is part of the problem, because then we get this cult of personality worship going on, which is exactly why people still worship Pound, even though he was a terrible person and a terrible poet. Pretty good editor. Okay, he was good at editing and making other people read better than that.
Fair to Pound. He wasn't a terrible poet. He's an excellent poet.
Well, I can't read Pound. He puts me to sleep.
He wrote a lot of terrible poetry.
He wrote a lot of very bad poetry.
First-rate, fantastic poetry. And I loathe the man's politics in life.
Yeah, I've gone on the internet and actually checked in and heard some of his broadcasts from Mussolini, not in his voice, but transcripts, and they are absolutely incredible.
Right.
But he was a proactive editor who was rambling about for many years trying to find the best people who are writing. We don't have that anymore.
Well, he was poetry's Apollinaire at around the same time. Let me just get back.
The slush pile is too big for any one person to do that anymore, frankly.
Mm-hmm. Let me just get back.
So it ain't going to happen.
It's all the same poem, though.
Let me just get back to the idea of isms. Now, I'm looking here. I've got in my hand the January-February 2003 Poets and Writers issue, which David Alpaugh's first column came out in. And I remember I had written a letter to the editor that didn't get published regarding your piece, David, and I don't recall it off the top of my head. But basically, my main gripe with your article was, like many people, you didn't name the names. You should have named bad poets, the bad editors, the bad publications. That's one of the things that I go out of my way to do on my website, is say, this person is a bad poet, or this is a bad poem. Now, the thing is, on the cover is this fellow, about 30, Kevin Young, a black guy with a goatee, and he's a terrible poet. I've got his collected first 4 books or so. But the thing that gets me is, he's a jazz poet. Now, his poetry has no music, much less be jazz, but because he's black, he's either a jazz or a blues poet.
Or hip-hop.
And it's ridiculous, and this is just yet another box that people try to put poets into, and the only reason that this guy is published is he probably went to X workshop, met so-and-so poet, who knows who's the one, AI, or one of the other published older black poets. And he got published, his book got published, it got reviewed here and there, and now he's on the cover, and he's a jazz poet.
Yeah, I think that you're raising an interesting question there that we can't answer because we're not in the smoke-filled rooms. How does someone like Kevin Young get on the cover of Poets and Writers magazine?
Yeah.
Or somebody on the cover of APR? What process goes...
That's what I want to know.
Yeah. We don't know.
Well,
I think Dan hit the nail on the head, frankly. I mean, not to indulge in cliches, but it's something very close to it.
I think they have to pick people who... APR has, I haven't seen a good poem in there. maybe one by Stanley Kunitz a few months ago.
They reprinted The Broken Tower by Hart Crane about 5 years ago. That's the only good poem in the 16 years I've been. But
the thing is like, if anything was really good by someone alive, I think, it's the whole thing of making everything look terrible by comparison. And if everything is sort of dull and banal, then it sort of blends together and you can't really distinguish.
And that's the whole thing by not criticizing other poets is you don't criticize me, I won't criticize you. And I run a poetry group here, and last Friday, that poem that I brought, Art, I rarely do sort of overtly political poems, and I did. And I changed the title, I cut it by about a third and whatnot, I excised a lot of things. But I appreciate the fact that Arthur or my wife or a handful of other people that come to the group will tell me, this doesn't work, this isn't good. But, at all of these workshops, and I've been to a handful, I once one summer went to the Brockport Writers Festival in upstate New York, people don't give you criticism.
Tell him, we had this guy come to our UPG, Uptown Poetry Group, about a couple months ago. He was one of these guys who just basically introduced himself and says, "Hello, I'm bipolar, blah, blah, blah." And then when he brought this horrible, horrible poem, I felt uncomfortable because I knew he wasn't going to be able to take the criticism. And then when Dan said it wasn't good, he was shaking.
It was a page and a half basically saying that he hated George W. Bush, which is fine if you want to have that thing, but there was absolutely no art. It was George Bush, you suck. George Bush, you're a liar. George W. Bush, George Warmonger Bush, George this, blah, blah. And it's like, he asked me, is there anything good? I said, no. And like she said, he was visibly shaken because he's never gotten criticism because he always mutes the criticism by saying I'm bipolar. And other people mute the criticism by saying, oh, I'm
an alcoholic.
I'm an alcoholic. I was raped. I was incested. I'm a left-handed lesbian from New Orleans. It just gets ridiculous.
And so then it becomes an attack of the person, and not they think, if you say, you put your confessional stuff out there and you say, okay, I was raped, boo-hoo, and then someone says it's bad, they say, oh, you're attacking me, why, boo-hoo,
Well, but, artists have always made that little psychological error of confusing their artwork with themselves. Mm-hmm. Therefore, if you give honest critique, you're attacking them personally. That's so common. But that's also part of what's problem with the whole MFA system is, I actually read, I can't stand Ivor Winters, okay? I think he was a terrible poet and a terrible teacher.
Worst critic.
Worst critic. Conrad Aiken dismissed him in Conrad Aiken, who was a great critic, dismissed Ivor Winters in about 2 paragraphs as...
I disagree. I've always liked Ivor Winters as a critic. I think he's got a moral sense and a sense of
But the problem is he had no good poetry. He had no art.
I don't think he's a great
he was
poet
really,
at all.
really terrible at teaching.
But I think as a critic, he actually did have...
But the thing is now he's influenced he's basically one of the 2 or 3 people, along with William Stafford and a couple other people, who influenced the whole MFA program. Well, so we have millions of Ivor Winters clones out there, and I have read Ivor Winters actually. I actually read an essay by him once where he said, this is how you critique a poem. You never say anything negative about the poem. And that is bullshit. Yeah. Because if the poet cannot learn unless you give them honest criticism. Right. They cannot learn that to be a better writer by saying, well, you could do better, instead of saying, this is exactly what's wrong with this piece. You've got to be honest with the critique. Otherwise, nobody improves as a writer, which is why we have all these mediocre poets out there.
Actually, I think the whole MFA thing is simply the wrong way to go. I consciously chose not to go into an MFA program and to stay away from them. And I can't imagine anybody learning how to write by sitting in a classroom.
Right.
I took a private tutorial with Robert Hayden, not in a class.
Much better.
He had only 3 to 5 students a semester, and he rejected lots of manuscripts that he didn't take people on. And it's an entirely different experience. I feel that's the way that apprenticeships for writers should go in the university.
Exactly.
Well, but the university won't make money doing that.
Right. And the whole idea of apprenticeship, not only in poetry, but in all the art forms and in all human endeavors, is something that has been lost. I mean, I think one of the things that I've found wrong with colleges is most people that I've known that have come out of college have their individuality muted. Whereas the old idea of a master and apprentice strengthened the individuation. Let me just end this segment. Worse than Winters, even though I think he was a better critic, was Randall Jarrell, because I think Randall Jarrell, who has always been considered a very good critic, was so dismissive. And I'm not a big Donald Hall fan by any means, but I remember there was an essay in one of his books of poems where it was a 4 or 5 page essay on 3 or 4 books of poems, and the Donald Hall poem book he just dismissed in just one little offhanded comment, which it was a funny barb, but it didn't give the reader or writer any sense of the poet or the poems or why they were good or bad. And I think a lot of it has been a reaction that Randall Jarrell in the mid-20th century was such a towering figure in criticism that I think that might have had some influence. But nonetheless, let's end this segment, and we're going to hear a poem by Fred Glaysher, and when we come back, we're going to talk about more of why poetry is bad. Here's a poem.
Fred Glaysher, reading Dag Hammarskjold from a book Into the Ruins. Dag Hammarskjold spoke once on classical music, including Beethoven, and this piece somewhat alludes to his statement there. Dag Hammarskjold. No more of these sad tones, the fear and the scourge of war, chaos and anarchy, the passions of humankind. Though the first movements wander among the dark and threatening conflicts of Beethoven's Ninth, the ode to joy shall come. All the millions will unite as brothers, surrendered to the way of peace, to a higher synthesis of joy.
All right, we're back here with my wife Jessica, my co-host Arthur Durkee, Fred Glaysher, and David Alpaugh on the line talking about poetry. And David, you had sent me an email a week or two back, and it was regarding the little imbroglio earlier this year when a noted poet, Quincy Troupe, had been fired from I believe it was the University of San Diego, because he had faked information on his resume. And given the idea that poets are always talking about artist truth and whatnot, it's kind of ironic. But anyway, David, if you want to just talk a little bit about that situation.
Yeah, I think what was interesting for me in that is that in the course of the articles written on that situation, a little fact was brought out there that Quincy Troupe was earning $141,500 at UC San Diego, and I think
quite a scam going there.
Yeah, and I think that you have to start adding on to that his fees for judging contests, his fees for participating in conferences. I think the notion that poets are financially poor is not true for the profession.
Oh, sure.
I think that professional poets are almost routinely earning 6 figures. Some of them are in the millionaire category.
Yeah. And there's no reason for an Adrian Rich to get yet another $300,000 genius grant.
But the criteria for giving a MacArthur or a Kingsley Tufts is that the person is a senior poet who doesn't need the money, that is going to have no real effect upon his or her poetry whatsoever. Yeah. I mean, that's the criteria almost.
And the Haydens or the James Emanuels who are working at a factory second shift, busting their asses, who could really use it to have 5 years off to complete a book or two that might change something, they don't get it. They're not even in the nominating process.
Yeah. I came up with a little acronym that is, I think, is sort of the subconscious acronym for the poetry profession. I call it INAPS, INAPS. It's not about the poetry student.
Yeah.
Sorry, this is about our mortgage. This is about our trip to Italy next year. Yes, you may write very well. You may write as well as we do. You may, in fact, write better than we do. But if you do not have the teaching post, if you are not part of the profession, we really have no interest in you.
Yeah. And, you know, my wife, one of the things that stuck in her craw about a year or so ago, there was a fellow who had posted some poems, and he's a well-known poet named Clayton Eshelman, and he had been emailing us back and forth. And Jess, you might want to tell him about what Eshelman said about Elizabeth Bishop. This is just sort of archetypal nonsense. Go ahead.
Well, I asked him what he thought of Elizabeth Bishop. I like Elizabeth Bishop. I don't think all her poems are good, but I think she has about a dozen or so really excellent poems. And he said, oh yes, she's very good. A lot of her poems are very well written, but I gave a negative review of her collected poems back in the 70s when it came out or whenever it was, because she didn't write about politics in Brazil during that time. And then I said to him, you admit they're well written, yet you give a negative review? That doesn't make any sense. And then he never addressed it. But I just thought that was so ridiculous, because that's not really fair. If she chooses not to write about that, why should she be penalized? I mean, she writes about, you know, the small things that she observes, and frankly is better than most, you know, political poets who think that they say something important.
She writes very well about her small little world.
Right.
Yeah.
And deserves credit for it.
You know, if you pick up, I think that the editorial interference in poetry is another subject that we might talk about.
Mm-hmm.
If you pick up something like the Poet's Market and start reading the statements from editors.
Oh, yeah.
Don't want to see poems over 30 lines. No rhyme or meter, please. You know, it's just part of the whole repression of creativity for editors to be prescribing what poets should be writing about and how they should be writing it.
My wife wants to read something here a little bit.
Today I printed out online this little thing about James Tate, and I don't think he's a good poet personally. I've skimmed through his selected poems. I'd like to just beat him. He's a terrible poet. He just can't even.
I used him as an example in the second part.
Yeah. He can't even break a line. Well, okay, it says James Tate wins 1995 Tanning Prize, $100,000 for mastering the art of poetry, and then the judges were John Ashbery, Jory Graham, and Charles Simic. Then he gives his little definition of what he thinks poetry is, blah, blah, blah. But when I was looking at the judges, all three of them have won a Pulitzer, all three of them have MacArthur Foundation grants, and Graham and Simic both have Guggenheim Foundation. Now,
they're the made men of poetry.
Now, how is it that all three judges have the same prizes, and it's just so obvious that it's like, you know, oh, I'll vote for you this time, vote for me next time. So it's like, it doesn't even, anyone outside of this, how does anybody stand a chance? I mean, you really don't even have a chance, because they're just all pals.
Yeah.
It's kind of sick. And then the fact that he wins this $100,000 for terrible writing, that he's probably making a decent salary. Maybe he's a good English teacher, I don't know, but if he's making six figures, you do not need $100,000. I'm sorry, I just don't think those prizes should go to someone who's making that.
Well, anyway, another, I know Arthur, speaking of criticism, one of the best published pieces of criticism that I think has appeared in the last 30 years was a piece by a fellow named Robert Peters, and it's in his book, Where the Bee Sucks. And it's an outstanding essay called Divining Rod. And it basically takes about 25 or 30 snippets of poems. Half of them are by Rod McEwen, the singer-songwriter poet of 60s, 70s fame. And the rest are lines from well-known poems by well-known poets. And you can't really tell the difference. And I later did an essay basically defending people who have been called doggerless, people like a McEwen or Richard Brautigan or Joyce Kilmer. And when you look at most modern poetry, I mean, they're really, I mean, I can't, when I think of a Jane Kenyon or a Donald Hall, they're not better than a Eugene Field. I mean, they are the Eugene Fields of this day, and yet they get this praise. Whereas a Eugene Field, even in his day, was really marginalized. I mean, David or Fred, I mean...
Peters, by the way, has another book called The Hunting of the Snark.
Yeah.
In which he shows how there are these various themal categories that are hammered into the ground with, hundreds of thousands of poets writing the Barbie poem or the, academic abroad poem, whatever the category is.
Or the dog poem.
Or yeah, and he is, and Peters is, I think, a tremendously useful critic. I mean, he was utterly fearless. Didn't care who the person was that he was writing about, and really clearing away the crap and the deadwood, and kind of trying to get to the heart of the matter. Great critic.
Pretty good poet too.
Yeah, yeah.
But it should be noted that his influence was basically in the 60s and 70s. I think most of those essays were then. In the last 20 years or so, I don't know if he's dead or not.
No, he's very old. He's probably in his in his 80s now.
Yeah, he's in his 80s now. He's still living out in California.
But another useful tool, and I wrote an essay on this, is hoaxes. People like the Ern Malley hoax or the Iraqi Yasasada hoax of a few years back. Just to give you an example, we had on my website Kent Johnson, who pulled off this Iraqi Yasasada hoax in the APR back in '97, had written in response to my essay. And basically, this was this pullout section in the American Poetry Review of the poems of this supposed poet who died in Hiroshima. And they were terrible poems. I don't care if he died. I don't care if he was a saint. They were terrible poems, and I even said that. Then the next issue, they corrected it because they found out Johnson and a couple of his students had hoaxed the thing. And to this day, for some reason, Johnson still is trying to go, perpetuate the hoax. But nonetheless, the point is they were terrible poems. And if you look at like the Ern Malley poems or the Ossian poems from, 150, 200 years ago, they're mostly bad writing, but because they were all foisted upon the poetry scene because of Ern Malley was a dead war hero. This guy died in Hiroshima. And I think people have to look at the work and forget the names.
And the thing is that they apologize for it in the second issue. We regret reprinting this, but it's like, well, if you praised
if they thought it was good.
If you thought it was good, why do you regret it?
Yeah, I mean, who cares whether it was written by 10 Cub Scouts or by, a published poet? I mean, it doesn't matter the provenance. It's the work that stands on its own.
Derivative work sells, though.
Well, another fellow I wanted.
It doesn't rock the boat.
Yeah.
Everybody recognizes it immediately. This is a poem.
Another thing that I've always found really disheartening is, I don't think that neo-formalists are particularly good, at least as the ism. But there have been people who've written formal poetry in the last 100 years or so that have been sort of shunted aside by high modernism. And one of the people, I don't know if either of you are familiar with his work, was a fellow from Nebraska called John G. Neihart. And he had written a poem about a long epic cycle of the West. But some of his shorter lyrics are just outstanding, and he was very innovative with line breaks and whatnot. And another poet, my wife actually wrote a novel about this poet, Hazel Hall. Well, not about the poet, but in which it references her. And it's amazing how some of these poets that are really good fall through the cracks, and yet you can find these little nuggets sitting on these used bookstore shelves.
Mm-hmm. And also the neo-formalist movement, how a lot of good formalist poets went totally into neglect and were not read at all anymore, and suddenly you have all these young people writing in form, and they're getting all the attention.
Yeah.
Harold Witt was a formalist poet, whom I mentioned before, who, again, nobody was talking about him. They're talking about Marley Peacock or,
one thing I remember, David, from your article was how in the MFA programs, the poetry students seem to be the worst writers. I think you mentioned, I can't remember how you said it, but they can't quite write fiction, so they try to pass themselves off as poets. And this one guy that goes to our poetry group who runs the website, he writes mostly fiction, and he said that the worst fiction stories he gets are shorter because there's not a lot of character development for this or that reason. And then he said maybe that's why so many bad writers do poetry, because it's just, they think because it's shorter, it's easier, and you can write 10 lines. And
except that
just write a little anecdote about what happened to you today on the way to the post office.
Right, and neglecting the fact that one of the shortest forms ever, the haiku, is actually rather difficult to write.
I've never actually succeeded at it. So
I've written probably, let's say I've attempted probably 3,000 or 4,000 haiku in my lifetime, and I think I would feel good about maybe 50 of those. So it's hard to pull off.
Yeah.
I compared it in one of my essays as like a gymnastics meet. You have to be on. You have to, you can't, poetry is exact. You have to be specific. Prose, you have a lot more leeway with it. But, poetry, and then when it's sloppy, like David Lehman, I mean, come on, those aren't even poems. It's just like, I went outside today and got my paper and walked down the street and
I want to ask Fred and David. I've talked about this before, I believe, on the show briefly, I think in our first show, and Art's heard me talk about it a number of times. Speaking of provenance, I think one of the reasons that good art or good poetry doesn't get propagated is artistic jealousy. And I think the basis for artistic jealousy is what I call the divine inspiration fallacy. And that's the idea that the primogenitive force of the poem is not the individual, but it's something up there in the clouds and the Aries that you can pull down. And if
will.
Yeah. And if it's up there and I've pulled something down and she's pulled something down and the other person pulls something, there's less up there for the jealous person, and they feel that something is missing. I'm just wondering, this is just something that over the years I've noticed, and it's just sort of my pet little idea. Do you believe, either of you believe in the muse, or do you believe that it might have an effect on why poets or artists in general tend to be really sniping at each other?
I'd never want to blaspheme the muse. I wouldn't
Good.
dare.
Be careful. Yes.
Only adoration is appropriate.
Well, but I mean,
deserving.
Then, I mean, give me an idea. I mean, you certainly, I'm sure, have seen a lot of the sniping. I mean, one of the things, I mean, I love when I'm at my poetry group and someone brings a good poem. I mean, it stokes my fires. I don't know if my body language, I'll sit up in my chair.
And he can't talk anymore. He gets too excited.
but it really stokes me, and I enjoy it. It gives me a rush. Yet I've been at many poetry readings, and I've been at poetry groups with other people. You can see their eyes sort of glaze over. They get very stiff in their seat, and there's a kind of real anger. I mean, I think it's really an anger that someone has done something, that they know that poem is better than their poem, and they're not going to be the top dog that night.
It's basic human emotion and envy and jealousy, you're onto, and that happens in all walks of life.
Yeah, I hear again and again from poets commenting on, Bill Moyers or wherever. I'm not writing it. It's coming to me. I don't know where it's coming from. It's almost like it's a religious matter.
Yeah.
It's not a matter of my intellect or my sensibility or my craft. It's just coming down to me. I am something of a fan of writer's block. I think writer's block is good. I think what writer's block means is that you don't have anything to write at that particular time or moment. So let it rest.
Right, yeah.
Yeah.
Speaking of Bill Moyers, I'll tell you, he's one of these people that just annoys the hell out of me. About 4 or 5 years ago, he had come to town. I guess he had his latest PBS,
the Genesis series.
The Genesis, and he was talking about poetry, this, that, and the other thing, and he was talking about how his wife is a good poet, and this, that, and he went on, and he was so conscious of where he was. I remember someone asked him a question, and when he talked about the poet, he used the term, well, the poet, she has this. And about 5-10 minutes later, someone in the audience said, I just noticed that when you referred to the poet, you referred to the poet as a she. Did you realize you were doing that? And he goes on, no. And you could see the gleam in his eye that he was playing this politically correct little game, snaring in the gullible people. And I just find him and his whole shows, I mean, there was one show, what was the one, when at the Eleanor, the Dodge Festival, I remember, I think it was Naomi Shihab Nye, and he goes, he asked her this question, literally, it was something like this. There's a line in a poem of yours that poetry rises up from your shoes. Do you really mean that it was coming from your shoes? And I mean, this is on public television.
Okay, I'm going to piss everybody off again, because I am actually one of those poets who feels sort of like it's dictated and given to rather than I intellectually set out to write a poem. The fact of the matter is I never sit down and write a poem. I wait for them to happen. That does not mean that my intellect is not engaged, and it does not mean that my craft is not engaged either, because there's plenty of craft and experience that strengthens the voice coming through. But I would definitely say that for me it is a spiritual experience. And Dan has told me more than once that this sort of like he doesn't understand this because he works at his poetry and he does good poetry, but he works at it. Our ways of creating are totally different. The fact of the matter is I know from my own experience that at least for some people, at least some of the time, and for some people probably all of the time, poems are something that you receive, that are given to you. I'm not going to use any new age bullshit like saying, oh, it's channeled from the muse or stuff like that. But I am going to say that there is a spiritual element to it. All of my best poems have been like, what the hell happened? I don't remember writing that. In fact, the same is true for my music.
But if that were true, Art, couldn't someone do your poem? You know, I mean, someone could.
No one can do my poem because it's still coming through my filter and my voice, and everybody's unique experience filters the content. And, you know, it's sort of like the same idea can come through 5 different people, but they won't all say it the same way because they've had different life experiences, they have different vocabularies, they have different educations, and they won't say it the same way. I mean, one of the things that I love about translation is I'm fluent in about 4 languages, and I know for a fact that there are phrases that I can say in Indonesian that I can say in 2 words that take me a whole paragraph to say in English. They do not connect whatsoever, and even then it doesn't really bring the idea across. So I don't buy the, you know, you can just do the perfect imitation thing. You can do a cheap imitation and you can do a parody. That's another story.
Well, let's end this segment, and we'll listen to a poem by Arthur Durkee, by my wife Jessica, and myself as well. And when we come back, we'll be talking more about poetry with Fred Glaysher and David Alpaugh.
Let me correct just one thing.
Okay,
I
go
don't
ahead.
want Hayden to roll over in his grave. He never worked in a factory.
Okay.
Thank you.
I was just using that as
No problem.
Yeah, he was a professor, wasn't he?
yeah. Anyway, let's.
Unrefined. I'm vulgar. If I were wheat, I'd be vulgar. If I were a bird, I'd be crow. If I were absurd, I'd be Patso. If I were a Norse god, I'd be Loki. If I were a dance, the hokey pokey. Slip me the keys to the kingdom, and I'll let the riffraff come, the leper, the beggar, the poet, and the bum. If I were on the surface, I'd be scum. If I could put on strings, I'd be a ukulele. And if Segovia came, I'd say, sorry, only Arthur Godfrey can strum me. Things gross in nature become me. I am the chaff which the wind driveth away. I am the human laugh of the feral child at play. I'm the only man at the brothel who still goes upstairs with Olga. Even my rhyme is half-ass. I'm vulgar.
From the box of the zoo fox. Consciousness blinks. The star of the eye seems to recall a swiftness into being young. Barking at play, the kin of wild terrain junctures to relocation whether his willingness played or not. Now all is gone as captivity seasons freedom's wave. A cage distinguishes his days as they wave, these visitors who pass and stare. For what seems in habit and Arctic having now gone artificial in glass surrounds. Being a zoo-boxed fox, the native of chilled weather, his sides attend to circling all the while, repetitive as dream on dream, charging while an earth invades an earth's enclosure. The wave settles its grazing eye. He wonders whether curiosity is worth this space. Seems evolution had a trick in mind when being planned, a pup among a mother's pups gone awry. Into summer now, he is too gonzo to remember his wintered twist of interest. While fowl and frogs plea for the wind to cease being, the Arctic creeps to the shore's northern waves. The sea keeps creatures moving at what sees a city of their own demise, crisp, weathered ice continuing. For what is whither but the orb of wander? All chasing has gone graced in embracing his cage at what seems to shine. For dimness always is the wild nocturne. There is no light, only dream, that waves under the slip of pasture and plain, a non-being who muscles between the wheels of his being. A cage awakens in a stir unwaved beneath the crawled-in place. All effort has gone through glass. Nerves clutch in shadow-like vein, while silenced in tracing, a fibrous seal on entering nor slipping freedom. Whether a fox dream matters or not, as real or seemed, one cannot know when grasping for weathered glaciers, unending worlds of world, the wild wild.
Wing Mercy. Old crow hunches over carrion near leafless autumn bridge, contemplating watercourse way. Everything still but the wind, eyes dancing. Not every dancing is outside. A single cardinal feather on the walk, an old, old goddess. Everyone talks to her, listening. Oak leaves tick on the paved stones. Something quiets the gray, jays breaking silence from inland trees. Basalt stairs collapse, pounding light into limonite. Whitebird rises, white rook in a black sea. Wings shaking against rain, rustling, shush and flutter of every roost grabbing air. Ruffed grouse crossing where the culvert's out. The self that is breaking away, hard, ionic, brittle. Manganese and silver ore, green swirling malachite. Baptism of loon and sandstone. Gray sky rumble, rolling thunder shakes the green, approaching. Tents of pine boughs perfected by unspoken listening. Tick, tick, kiss, spatter, tick, flume, boom, boom, boom. And every branch contains a crow. Not every dancing is inside either.
All right, we're back here, and we're going to talk about bad poetry, and during the break, Fred Glaysher was giving us a little summation. So, Fred, why don't you pick up and start this off?
It just, to me, if you're talking about bad poetry, you have to confront the fact that of bad literary periods or whole movements, literary history in any nation goes through whole different aesthetic changes, and we are definitely at the tail end struggling to get out of the whole postmodern period. And really, when you look back in history, it's roughly 50 years cycle for a whole lot of different other times. And I don't know, that's my point, that we don't have that sense enough, but we have all the unhappiness and struggle and turmoil of that. And coupled with that is really a whole change of what drives that, I would even say, is the change of human consciousness and society, purpose and meaning in life.
Yeah, I think that...
or lack thereof.
I think that the period of, say, in this country at least, from 1910 to 1970 was a golden age. It was about a 56-year period, and the last 30 or so years have been down the tubes. But that's to be expected, you know, maybe by 2020.
Society changes, and art changes, people change with it.
Well, and art is partly a human response to life.
Absolutely.
You know, and social change, so...
But every period becomes ossified and prevents a new vision from coming in and being heard. And it's only with real perseverance and dedication that that any movement, I mean, this happens in science and other fields where something new finally receives a hearing.
Well, let me just ask this. One of the things that people always talk about, there's not enough people reading poetry the way they used to, supposedly. But poetry has always been a marginal art form in terms of the masses, in terms of people reading it and whatnot. How much of that...
It's not always. Browning, for instance, had a huge audience. Tennyson, I mean, that time did have an enormous audience.
Yeah.
And it's partly that memory that creates the nostalgia, let's say, for that in people today.
How much of this lack of real interest in poetry is due to the fact that most poetry books are so formulaic? They're 40 to 60 pages long in 3 parts with epigraphs in each to lead off each section. How much of that has to do with the fact that a 40-page book of poetry, paperback, the average price is going to be about $14-15 when you can get, a novel for half that price. Just basic marketing.
$141,000 a year.
Well,
remember what? Really, seriously, it's very relative. To me, it's not the price; it's really the similarity and the predictability of poetry that has partly worked against it. But there's also the whole social loss and change and complications that people in all intellectual circles have discussed. Really, it's the knit and grind of nihilism and so on.
I think the professionalization aspect really kicks in here and leads to, by its very nature, to a deterioration and watering down of poetry. I think when it is your business to attract people into your creative writing program to write poetry, there is a great temptation to lower any kind of craft barriers and to make it just as simple and easy, and to say to, there's that kid in his dorm room, he's trying to decide right now, am I going to major in sociology or political science or literature or creative writing with an emphasis in poetry? You don't want to say to him, well, we're first going to study prosody, and you're going to learn about duration and number and accent.
Right. You don't need that.
No. You don't have to do any of that stuff. Can you write a little story? Just write the little story, and we'll trick it out into lines and make it look like a poem.
How does that...
I think the profession is, in a curious way, almost becoming anti-poetry. And you have this movement, to prosify poetry and make it more and more like not distinguished dense prose, but just very pedestrian prose, almost in some cases encyclopedia kind of prose. And you also have I'm hearing more and more we can't define poetry. We don't have any definition of poetry. We don't want to do that. That's restrictive.
Throw out a deconstruction.
Yeah.
How does the cult of personality feed into that? I mean, speaking as a former academic who managed to escape, if there's one thing about life in academia that I despised on a daily basis was the inflated egos of virtually every tenured person I ever encountered. A male, female, professor, disc jockey, you name it. So, in terms of attracting, don't universities hire cult personalities so that they can attract students for their writing programs as well? I mean, doesn't that feed the loop too?
Absolutely, yes. That's very prominent in their hiring decisions.
Okay.
I'm sure that's the reason that Quincy hired at UC San Diego.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. Stars attract dollars, funding, and more bodies to justify state funding.
One of the things I always wonder to myself, and I constantly ask, and maybe you two can answer, do you think that these people, like someone like James Tate or Donald Hall, or do you really think that they think they're good? Like, does Donald Hall really think he's like as good as Whitman, or do they...
Well, I traded letters for about a year with Donald Hall when I was editing Hayden's prose, and sent him Once Upon a Time, early essay of mine, loathing postmodernism and self and confessionalism, and my first book of poems, and which took that along. And he was very much, I got the sense back of a hurt ego and indignant that I would send it to him. Okay, and perhaps it was a bit too brash, but that I think that goes with the territory.
Well, I'll tell you,
trying to preserve that territory.
One of the things I've never understood about Hall is when I was 21, I subsidy published a terrible derivative, like Poundian kind of shit poem, and I sent it around to a number of poets. I think Amy Clampett was one, a few, this was like in the mid-'80s, and one of them was Donald Hall, and he was the only one that I think actually responded with it, and he said, no, this isn't a good poem, and he gave one or two reasons which were accurate. And as I got older and I got to be a better writer, the thing I never understood is, if he could see that in this young, childish kind of poetry, what's wrong with it? Why can't he see that his own poems are bad? And it's like, does no one ever... maybe he's never been in a writing group.
But that's basic psychological law. Again, nobody knows the inside of their own mind. They can't see the inside of their head nearly as well as they can see the inside of the head of the person next to them. I mean,
well, you have to be able to divorce yourself to a certain degree.
To some extent, but
I think it's also easy to become self-deceived after you have that reputation.
Yeah, exactly. Right.
I remember, about 10 years ago, I was in a workshop with Gerald Stern, and he was talking about how he hadn't submitted poems formally to a publication in years.
Yeah.
They would
ask him.
They would sue him and ask him. The New Yorker would call and say, "Do you have something?"
Speaking of
cult of personality,
and when you're
in that position, it becomes very tempting to kind of believe that everything that you write is wonderful.
Right. Right.
Yeah. I was one of my if I were to think of one of the goals of any artist or certainly of a poet, forget publication, forget this. If you could ask me what would be the thing that I would want, it would be that in 10,000 years, 10,000 galaxies away, there would be some creature on some cruiser somewhere, maybe bored, hauling some stuff from one galaxy to another, that maybe when he or she or it is bored, punches up something and is looking around the arts or the literature of obscure galaxies, and maybe they come across the Milky Way galaxy, and maybe they look, ancient poets of a certain era, and they maybe come across a poem of mine, they read it, and they go, it or he understood it. And that to me, art is always about communication. It's a higher, elevated form of a communication. To me, I'm biased, but I'll say I think poetry is by far the highest of the art forms because it does the most with the least.
I vote music for that one, but oh well.
Well, but music, that's another argument. But that to me is one of the things that I think to me defines what poetry should be. I don't think that most people have that sense in art. To me, all it is for most people and most bad poets and most bad artists is that primal scream, I'm here. And I'd be lying if I said that all artists, myself included, there isn't a part of that. But if you want to be a good or a great artist, that has to be in the minority. That has to be a small part of it. There has to be something that has to be more something outgoing than incoming. And I don't think that's out there in poetry today.
Yeah, I think you also have to have the desire to continually transform yourself.
Right.
And keep changing. I mean, that's one of the things you look at Yeats's poetry, his early poetry. He really ended up in a totally different place in the 20th century. But there are a lot of senior poets today who are writing exactly it wouldn't be so bad if they were writing exactly as they had written 30 or 40 years ago. They're writing parodies and watered-down versions.
And speaking of Quincy Troupe is that. I mean, this was a guy, and speaking of jazz poetry, which I ripped earlier, Quincy Troupe is one of the 3 or 4 people I think that actually could write jazz poetry, his early poetry.
Yeah, the Magic Johnson stuff.
Right. He wrote it. He actually, though, didn't do it in the sort of 3-syllable tercet forms that passes as jazz poetry. He wrote it as paragraph, but it was musical and what. Then he got into this thing with every word, the personal pronoun I, capital I, as EYE, I, the organ, and he did that in poem after poem after poem, and it became like Jackson Pollock just dripping the word I all over his poems, and they became just terrible.
Uh-huh.
And I think one of the things too is I've noticed, now you named Yeats, and Stevens is another one. There are very few poets that actually get better as they get older. I think the prime time for most poets is probably between the mid-30s to about 50. Those poets that have lasted, there's that 15-year window or so where they are. Before that, they're too young, they're too green, they're experimenting, it's mostly juvenilia. Then they'll hit their stride, and then they become echoes of themselves. And I'm wondering, do you think that's maybe a natural process, that there is that prime time? Because someone like a Yeats or a Stevens, I think, are the exception to the rule.
Or Shakespeare, who had tremendous transformations through his career. Yeah, that happened to Wordsworth. Wordsworth had a brief window of about 10 years where he was really less than that, probably, where he was writing at the top, and then
Coleridge or Keats, and brief one way, but there are certainly many poets who wrote very well long into life.
Name some.
I don't.
Well, I think Rilke is a prime example. I mean, everybody thinks that Rilke's career ended with the Duino Elegies and the Sonnets to Orpheus in 1922, but he lived another few years, and in fact he started doing is writing in French rather than German, and very few of his last French poems have been translated, but those that I have, he's starting a completely new direction there.
Did you ever read the A. Poulin translations?
Yeah.
Jeffers might be another one. He wrote up till he was like in the 60s.
But a lot of Jeffers' later stuff were not as good as his earlier stuff. He wasn't as vibrant, but
I think Rumi is another one who continued to improve. He hit a very high peak and he just stayed there and then continued.
Let me ask both Fred and David, how do you define, or how do you critique and differentiate a good poem from a bad poem? David, if you want to go first.
Well, I think I am not adverse to coming up with a definition of poetry. I think you need to be willing to change it, and as you proceed. But I pretty much agree with Aristotle that poets are metaphor makers. I want to see doubleness in a poem. I want to see two tracks going on at the same time. I don't want to see just one literal track.
Right.
And that is unfortunately what I see in very many of the poems that I think need to be critiqued at the most fundamental level, that they are simply one-track poems. There is no metaphor, and therefore there is no electricity going on.
And so no depth then either.
And no depth, and no exhilaration, and nothing to explore or to intrigue or to keep you going. The second thing is that my definition of poetry includes my belief that it is written at the syllabic level. At some level, everything drops away, and it is important, just the sounds, just the way the syllables are connected. And again, in that kind of literal poem, and when you get into totally prosified poems, there's just no appreciation of that musical element whatsoever.
And Fred, how about you?
Yeah, I would agree with all of that. And to me, I would look for tensions and antinomies.
Yeah,
right.
There has to be those dualities. There has to be depth in terms of some contrast and struggle within that to resolve something or approach something.
Well, let me just change the subject just a little bit. One of the personal pet peeves I've had is I believe most poetry should be musical. I think there can be a music of the eye. There can be some visual poetry here and there,
and a music of the ear.
Yeah, but I think the music of the ear. One of the things I've always talked about is what I call the metric fallacy. And I think the two noted poets that were published in the 20th century, in America at least, that basically rebelled against the idea of meter the most were Marianne Moore and Robinson Jeffers. Now, I believe, for example, unless you are James Earl Jones declaiming a Shakespearean sonnet, it's virtually impossible to only just have that on-off dual, metronomic stressed, unstressed. When I listen to anyone speak, and I've talked sometimes with many reporters who've tape recorded conversations with people, you have more or less sort of like what is it, the heartbeat, the heart monitor, where you see the peaks and valleys, and you can see dozens of little peaks and valleys. And to me, what'll make a run of say 10 lines musical is there'll be peaks in the beginning of the line, and maybe a valley at the end, and they'll be generally follow the same outline. But I've just never listened to a poem read by anyone, and I've been to over 1,000 poetry readings. I've just never heard that on-off meter stress. And to me, this has been the biggest hoax, the biggest fallacy, that there is such a thing as meter. And I'm just wondering, do you guys subscribe to meter or not?
I think in a metrical poem, the meter is an abstraction, and it's cut against the
it's a general blueprint.
Voice, and it's the duality, the kind of hearing that subtract meter there, broken against a natural speaking voice that intrigues me about a well-written metrical poem. I think that what you said about the poetry of the eye is interesting, because at the very moment when in the early part of the 20th century, when poets start to abandon meter and rhyme, you have imagism. You have the imagist movement. It's almost as if poets realized that you can't throw away what was so important an element without bringing something else in to attract the imagination, and the visual imagery becomes at that moment very, very important.
I'd want to add that the sensibility of the human and the humane has to be there in a way that's felt and connected, and you get that sense with, I think, great poetry. And without it, you have variation on a technique.
Let me just throw this out, because we were talking about political poetry earlier. One of the, I think, speaking of antinomies, one of the great dichotomies in poetry is Pablo Neruda. This is a guy who I think wrote some of the most lush, beautiful, personal love poems, but wrote some of Art has a book of Neruda here. He's leafing through, but he wrote horrible political poetry. And whether it's Marxist, that it was Marxist isn't the point. I don't care what thing is. If you look at the poem, it's almost like they were written by two different people. The political poetry is so unaware of subtlety, is so unaware of music, of form, and yet the personal, especially the love sonnets, are just some of the most wonderful poems ever written imagistically. And how does that happen?
And his last 6 books are just the most amazing thing I've ever read.
I guess it goes back to that Auden quote that I mentioned earlier, that poets expect a pass on the poetry when they get into political theology.
It's interesting too, because there's this bounce this idea around maybe a little bit. There's this tendency in Latin American poetry and literature in general to go for politics. I mean, South America, Central America, not only is it the home of Neruda and Octavio Paz from Mexico, but also people like Ernesto Cardenal, who actually studied with Thomas Merton briefly before going back down and then turning into a fairly bad political poet. But he had things to say.
I would get rid of the modifier. He's bad.
Okay, well, all right. I wouldn't go totally bad, but I'd go fairly bad with Cardinal. But then you also have, Gabriel Garcia Marquez and his, what became known as the magic realism, which is basically, in my opinion, the Latin American form of surrealism. And by the way, they did it better than the French ever did, all of them. But there's this tendency to be political in South American literature.
There are some notable exceptions. Cesar Vallejo was not particularly political. He wrote.
Well, actually, he was. It was just well cloaked.
Well,
it's buried under the images. Maybe that's why it works.
Right, and that's one of the differences. Political poetry, the politics do not necessarily have to be at the fore. A political poem can also be a love poem. It can also be a personal poem. It doesn't have to just be political.
Right. Okay.
Yeah. One of my pet peeves is I am continually wondering why such a odd and crazy culture as ours does not have a vibrant satirical poetry.
Yes.
I just don't understand that.
Good question.
You have it in comedy, you have it in the movies,
right.
in other arts, but there's almost nothing happening in poetry, satire-wise. And I'm not quite sure what to make of that.
Well, the people who pass as satirical are a guy like a Kenneth Koch or a Robert Creeley, although I doubt that I would consider them really humorous poets. I don't think they really are humorous poets. They've been sort of marginalized. Who was the last poet that was considered, a great poet that could be considered humorous?
Ogden Nash.
Well, yeah, but that's the point, though. No one really considers him a real poet. Well, anyway, let's end this segment, and when we get back, we'll talk about a little bit more on the failure. And I want to talk about editors, publishers, critics, get away from the actual writers of poetry. We're going to end this segment.
My second book, The Bower of Nil, a narrative poem, this is a short excerpt from it, and is really part of rumination, shall we say, of the persona Peter Marsh. Democracy, in some form or another, which the people shall freely choose, will outlive or crush communism. Somehow the challenge will be met and won. Spengler's Prussian socialism ended in catastrophe for all Europe, exposing the barbaric ethic of Darwin. Sooner or later, the time will come, regalvanizing the United Nations, formed to crush the onslaught of fascism, empowering the will to implement fully and unreservedly the UN Charter, a return to the Wilsonian ideal to preserve what civilization holds sacred. Toynbee was right, ever since Sumer. Caesar's legions will finally serve all nations. Then swords shall be beaten into plowshares, democracy yield its choicest fruit. Slowly, gradually, a marvelous world civilization will develop, with a world executive supported by an international force, guided by the adjudications of a supreme tribunal, serving the interests of all nations, implementing the decisions of a global legislature, freely elected by all the inhabitants of the diverse but unified planet, mirroring, however faintly, his kingdom.
Poetry itself. You are not the poet I love most, Marina Tsvetaeva. There is the feeling beside that which is felt, as if a great artwork beyond consciousness, whether gazing a church tower or being sifted through its panes, like alluvial photons, there, in a bowl of opening roses, made majestic by a slice of sight reflecting the spoke of sun upon a slab where something dead may lay, is an abstract of insight grown well within your wreath of verse, brief episode of touch still opening endlessly and growing, self-illumined, silent paladins of the muse, like nothing that ever was. I know nothing of life. Yet, handfuls of this distanceness flash subtle signals, kissing gently my eyes, my mind which wilders, yet prompts the words which core, then filter, sweetly a stumble of laughter, themselves into the subject's smile, removed from thought, as if you, inflaming the gestures of what may occur within, as if still seemingly supple to God's will, the many illusions of its breath. I know nothing of it. And then this love, of life, of it, of you, as if I were what you are, so strangely, itself, like you. I know nothing of you. Then, as if newly formed and felt, unexpectedly. All right, we're back here talking poetry with David Alpaugh and Fred Glaysher. And in this segment, we want to talk about not only the failure of poets or the failure of the craft, but the people outside who don't actually do the poetry, editors, publishers, critics. And I was just asking Fred Glaysher during the break to relate any tales he has about poets or critics or editors. And Fred, if you want to begin this segment.
Well, the whole publishing industry has become so parasitic on the academic crowd and reinforcing one another, and publishers, when they do publish poetry, they want to be sure they're going to get a return on their investments, and they're staying with the tried and true little postmodern stuff, or the friend of the poet, who's at least covering the expenses of publishing at the moment. So, it's become continually more inbred, and really, I can't imagine anything worthwhile and new coming out of any New York publisher or national publisher. And most people can. Most people really know anything about poetry and spend time really studying it and appreciating it.
Well, let me just ask David.
Many have come to that.
David, since you actually have started your own poetry press, let me ask you: do you expect to get any financial return on your investment?
Oh, absolutely not. No, I'm running it again at my own expense. But I'll tell a little story about a poem that's in my book, Counterpoint, because it kind of brought home to me how arbitrary everything is. It's a poem about a late 17th century poet called the Water Poet, because he ferries gentlemen over across the Thames back and forth, and he's talking about his poetry. And I thought, gee, well, this is a poem that will delight the academics. I usually would avoid academic journals and opt for journals where there was a single non-academic poet making the call. But I started sending it out to academic journals, and over a period of about 3 years, it was rejected a dozen times. Finally, at another academic journal that was in the same general league as the others, it was accepted. So 12 journals have rejected this poem and said it is not even worth publishing. Well, the issue of this journal that accepted the poem comes out, and I get the issue, and a check for $100 told me that this is the editor's choice for the best poem they published that year. And I said, what sense does this make?
So does it, but
not worth publishing in 12 other journals, but in this one, it's the best one.
But does it really all come down to personal taste? I mean, on the part of the editor or publisher, is that the conclusion we can draw from that? I mean,
I guess so.
See, this is one of the things that I really rail against. I mean, I think you have a matter of personal taste. If you have a great Walt Whitman poem, if you have a great Rilke poem, if you have a great poem by Lee Poe, name any one over through the centuries, Horace, whatever, you can say, well, you can't out Whitman, you can't out Lee Poe, and they're individual scrapes against greatness. But I don't think it's individual taste when you say that a Walt Whitman is better than Maya Angelou, or that an Emily Dickinson is better than James Tate. There are clearly quantifiable differences. A bad poem, to me, if I'm building a house here and the wall is crumbling, you can see that. To me, it's obvious. Now, you may not think it's quite as bad off it as it is, but to me, I don't buy this whole everything is subjective, because if everything's subjective, then there's no point in arguing. I think there are things that are objectively good or bad. And I think one of the things people mix up is the idea of excellence versus like. There are poets that I like, that I know are not good. I named one like Richard Brautigan. I like his poems are crap. I like Godzilla films, but I don't think that they're Citizen Kane. And then there are poems that are excellent, but aesthetically, I've never, for example, liked Robert Frost. He just doesn't do it for me. And whether we're talking about the dark Frost or the hokey Frost, there's just something about Frost. But I'm able to
favorite poet of mine.
Yeah, but I'm able to step back, and I can't deny that, I'd love to have written Home Burial. I'd love to have written, a half dozen of his other poems, regardless of my opinion. But people don't do that. And I'm just wondering, is that generally what you've encountered, that people have become so biased, whatever their tastes are, that they substitute taste for excellence?
I think so, yeah. I think and I also think there's... that the question that is often being asked when a poem comes across the desk at a literary journal is not, is this a good poem, but Sylvia Plath's question in The Applicant. Are you our sort of person?
Yeah.
Do you wear a brace, a crutch, or a hook? No? Then we can do nothing for you. You have literary magazines breaking down into sociological areas, so that the kind of poet who gets into exquisite corpse is very different sociologically than the poet who gets into the New England Review.
Right.
Yeah.
And it seems to me that that the poetry is almost, again, I return to that INAPS. It's not about the poetry, stupid. That's not what we're really doing here very often. We're not judging poetry. We're not trying to bring the best poetry to the attention of a reading public. We are trying to preserve our own fiefdom
and people like a Codrescu or a Bill Moyers even. Personally, I don't consider Codrescu really a poet. I mean, but most of the people who have wield some power in the world of poetry tend not to be poets, or they're not poets who are really any good. And I mean,
they're gadflies, hacks.
Yeah.
Which is in many cases one of the reasons why they have ended up as powerful editors, because in a number of cases they have seen that as an entree into getting their own poems published because other people are expecting to be published in their journal.
How about blurbism?
A form of cursing.
Yeah.
Let me mention an experience I had recently.
Okay, go ahead, Fred.
I was in Ann Arbor, and I picked up a copy of Book Sense 76, a newsletter for independent booksellers.
Mm-hmm.
And supposedly independent booksellers, when it was created, Book Sense, if you're familiar with it, not so long ago, it was to help promote new and creative work and fight off Barnes and Noble and Borders takeover, you know. But really, I was sort of not really surprised, but I couldn't help but notice virtually every book in this newsletter was from a New York publisher, major New York publisher, and it really made me think that here's one more attempt to break that stranglehold that's lost, and I think that's often been the case.
Well, let me just ask you: do you? I mean, I find it ludicrous when I've heard this the good independent versus the horrible book chain. I mean, out here in the Twin Cities, over the years, the most supportive bookstores that I've run across have been local Borders or an occasional Barnes & Noble, whereas most of the independent bookstores, they wouldn't hold a poetry reading, you know, if you scratch their asses. I mean, they just don't. And I just find it bizarre that you know, people are lamenting, you know, the demise of independent booksellers. I mean, yes, it would be good if most Barnes and Nobles or Borders, I think, had a good used books section. But I don't think there's anything wrong if you're out in the sticks in North Dakota and it's 50 miles to the nearest mall. You know, if there's a Barnes and Noble there, you know, the only other way you're going to get books is either ordering them online if you have the internet, or if they even still make book catalogs these days. So, I mean, I've just never understood that. And I think that's another, speaking of politics, I think that's another one of these loony ideas that have just been foisted out there in the last 10 or 12 years. Okay, no comment? Art?
Well, actually, I have a comment about that because I've worked in publishing and marketing on and off for about 20-25 years. Most of the people who publish catalogs, most of the publishers who publish catalogs are either the big name, multi-million-dollar publishers, primarily in New York, some in San Francisco or LA. I'm thinking like HarperCollins. But then the other catalogs you see in print tend to be the university presses. And the university presses are not well known for their literature choices. You can find a lot of good nonfiction through university presses, but university presses are fairly abysmal when it comes to publishing good poetry, and not particularly good at publishing good fiction or fiction collections either, at least in my experience. But the book collection is not a dead form. It's just harder to get to. The fact of the matter is, though, is that the flip side of publishing right now is, and this is something that I've lamented for 20 years, is now that we have desktop publishing, it's almost too easy to self-publish.
Oh, yeah.
Which is one of the reasons we have so much of that new crap out there. It's like impossible to wade through everything that's published anymore. Not to say that everything that's put out by a so-called vanity press is bad. In fact, in many cases, it's better than what's published by, Knopf or Fair Strauss Giroux. But wading through it is an almost impossible task. Hence, one wants to try and read reviews. Hence,
Yeah, but most of that self-published. By the way, I hope this isn't a bombshell, but my organization, Small Poetry Press, which is simply me and has never had anybody else in it, I design and print books for self-publishing poets, and I've done over 1,400 books.
Yeah.
But basically what I find is hardly any of those poets can handle more than 100 books. They take that minimum, and very few of them come back for a second 100 or a third 100. So these books are not getting out into the bookstores, and they are not being reviewed.
But that's partly because poets are lousy businessmen who have no sense of distribution and marketing, too. I mean, so they shoot themselves in the foot that way.
But it's also a kind of like multiplication of the loaves kind of thing, because they have these big dreams. It's almost like, like they're self-publishing this book, and it's so important, and it's going to, put them on the map, and they're ordering 100 copies. Well, how do you figure that out, that those 100 copies are going to get you to any significant readership?
But is the poetry any good? Because, I mean, let's face it, someone like an Emily Dickinson or Gerard Manley Hopkins, they weren't published basically. I mean, I think Hopkins had 3 or 4 poems in his lifetime, same thing for Dickinson. But basically, they were unknown in their lifetime. But their work did endure because there were people who discovered their poems, and the quality was evident to those people. They got published, and it propagated. So I think quality eventually does surface. The question would be, we can talk about whether this approach is good or that's bad, but it all gets back to whether the poetry is good, because you can have success as a poet. I mean, the most best-selling poet of the first half of the 20th century was Vachel Lindsay, and Lindsay, he's a competent poetaster. I mean, but he's not a particularly good poet, and there's a reason that he's pretty much unknown today to most contemporary poets.
Yeah. But this ties back into what David is doing and what some of the other small presses are doing, and what Sam Hamill's Copper Canyon Press started out as, because he started out very much like what you're doing back in 1975 or something like that. There's the fact of the matter is it really is possible for us to discover things that are we wouldn't find otherwise, simply because they're out there now. And the internet actually is a positive force in terms of weeding out some of the good stuff. The problem is we have this multiplication factor of so much more being available, therefore so much more work weeding through. The plus side, it seems to me, is the fact that eventually the stuff will rise to the surface of some quality. The problem is the time factor. Is it going to be in our lifetimes?
Are we going to see it?
Are we ever going to see it?
Ever see it?
Well, and that's kind of why I'm opposed to the whole cynicism side. I mean, basically, I'm cynical in the short term and optimistic in the long term. If that it's a paradox, but I can't put it any better way. But
I agree. I mean, I think in 15, 20 years, I mean, we'll be there will be published poets that will. I've always thought that the people who are going to end up burying. Name a particular bad poet, a Sharon
Jory
Olds.
Graham.
Yeah, or the people who are going to bury them are going to be sort of the left-wing, fringe, liberal, loony women critics in 15, 20 years, because they're going to say there wasn't any meat there. The bad black poets that are being published are going to be damned by the young black poets who are going to come up and say, that's not quite County Cullen. Why?
Yeah, and the sycophants who are supporting those poets, going to their workshops and buying their books and boosting them will be gone.
Yeah. And by the way, that sycophancy thing is rampant in the whole, quote, Nuyorican / hip-hop / slam poetry scene. I have yet to read, see, hear performed, or see on video one good poem coming out of the Nuyorican Cafe or that entire movement. Yeah. I think slam has done more to kill poetry than it has done to help it.
Has anybody read the deaf poetry book, the group that was produced on Broadway? I just went.
Oh, the Deaf Poetry Jam.
Yeah,
oh, it's abysmal.
Yeah. It's horrible. I mean, it's
awful.
Awful beyond belief.
Yeah, and the thing is that Nuyorican anthology from about 10 years ago to me is as dated as John Dryden's Political Intrigues of 3 centuries back.
Yeah, but the Deaf Poetry Jam. Well, you can get it on DVD now. It's just like, oh boy,
hugely successful.
Hugely successful.
But I mean, talk about just totally one track.
And it skews poetry into only being one thing. It's another ism.
Yeah, and all reads in this, it's all in the same mode, and
because I've
politically correct themes, and
and a particular style of delivery and subject matter. I mean, I get booed at poetry slams because my poetry is more like Gary Schneider's than anybody out of the Nuyorican, and they just like, who the hell are you? And I'm not the only one that's had that experience. I know. So,
well, I remember I was once. Went to a poetry reading and it turned out to be a poetry slam, and I didn't know that, and I refused to participate. But they asked me to be the judge, and so I was the judge, and the person who I thought was the best ended up losing out early, and the one who won was this cute, sexy little blonde girl with nice tits. And that's fine if the idea was to find the sexiest babe in the coffee shop, but it had nothing to do. It had nothing to do with the art.
But INAPS, it's not about the poetry, stupid. Yeah.
Let me just as we only got a few minutes left. One of the things that I really hate are what I call magalogs. Out here in Minnesota, we have a horrible magazine called Rain Taxi, and basically it's basically a catalog / magazine. They'll give the book, they'll give a little photo of the cover, they'll give the price, the publisher, and it's usually 2 or 3 paragraphs that are absolutely generic. The reviews are absolutely generic. There's nothing said individual about what the writer is. It's usually something about so and so's poetry has such a stupendous breadth of enormity. Or something like that. That's what describes the poetry.
We're having very large weather today. Yes.
Yeah. It's I've made a comparison. I think in one of my emails to Dan about sports versus poetry. It's almost as if somebody would, instead of Barry Bonds having a record, he would have a blurb on the back of a book saying, Bonds is one of the most important batters to emerge in the last 3 years. The grace of his swing is, exhilarates audiences
like
from one end of the ballpark to the other. Hey, he has a record. There's something objective. And we need to start establishing some more objective criteria for judging poetry and be willing to put ourselves on the line.
And that's the key. I love to argue, and if some, I would much rather argue passionately with someone, pro or con about a poet, the quality of the poem or whatnot. But you don't get that. That, to me, the thing is that people don't even have the guts to stand up for what they believe nowadays. You can believe that so and so is a great poet, and I can think they're crap, but there should be a way to argue about that, but people don't want to do that, and I think
they want to keep their ears down and wait for something to be distributed to them for keeping their ears down.
And I'm tired on the Rain Taxi reviews, how they're unlike so many poets today who blah blah blah. This poet blah blah blah, and it's like.
Well, let's end this show here, and I just want to give a plug to our 2 guests' websites. David Alpaugh is www.smallpoetrypress.com, and that's that basically you take orders for self-publishing poets and you produce the actual books then. So you're a hands-on man, and so anyone out there who's listening who wants to get something out in print, maybe go to the website and give David some business. Let me just ask Dave, I don't believe that you mentioned it in your essay, but name me, who do you think a big-name poet who really is bad? Come on.
Currently a big-name poet who's really pretty bad?
Yeah.
I think Mark Doty, whom I know you just wrote a review of, pouring those poems endlessly into the 3-line stanzas with the politically correct, emotional themes, would be one of my votes. Okay.
And Fred Glaysher, his website, and I've got it here, is www.fglaysher.com. And not only that, but he's also a real estate person, so if you're in the Michigan area, you might want to look him up and give him some business. But Fred, let me just ask the same question. I'll ask you, name me a bad, there are too many bad critics. How about... name me something that you think is really bad in the poetry world that you could change if you could. If you had one thing to change to try to ameliorate things.
List is too long. Oop.
Is Fred still there?
Is Fred still on? Is Fred still on?
Fred?
Is David still there?
Dave?
I'm here.
Oh, okay. I'm sorry. I guess we must have lost Fred. Maybe his cell phone went down.
Dear. Oh, well.
Oh, well. But anyway, www.fglaysher.com is Fred Glaysher's website. So little technical glitch there. But anyway, I want to thank both Fred and David for being on this show. And next month we're going to be talking about science with an astronomer named Fiorella Terenzi and a psychologist and talk show host Jeffrey Mishlove. And so that should be interesting. But again, sorry that we lost Fred. And if you're listening to the show, Fred, sorry, but we had some problems, I guess. David, thank you. And hopefully, do you think you're ever going to have something published in Poets and Writers again?
Possibly. I that was sort of a one-time article. I haven't written anything since then. But if so, hopefully there or somewhere else.
Well, if you do, I'll tell you, one fellow who would be good to get a little publicity, and I've written to them to say is a guy we had on, James Emanuel, earlier this year, and I would check out his poetry.
I listened to your show and found him quite wonderful.
Yeah. Well, anyway, thanks again, David, and sorry, Fred, but thanks to Fred Glaysher for being on our show as well, and we'll be back next month here with Art Durkee, myself, and Dave Wesley, our producer, for the Omniversica show. Thanks and good night.
Thanks.
Thank you.